Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday to you. I hope you had a good Easter. I'm starting to hear some things around our country. Stories of people who had experiences with Good Samaritans. And I have to tell you something. I love stories of Good Samaritans. In fact, I have those stories in my life. I have stories where people had been Good Samaritans to me, and also opportunities that I had in my life to be a Good Samaritan to somebody else. I thought I would share with you one of those stories in my life when I was very young, and somebody was a Good Samaritan to me. It happened in 1975. I was 18 years old. I had been married for less than a year. I had an infant son. My wife and I decided to go grocery shopping one Sunday morning. We drove to the grocery store, got out of a car, went in, did our shopping. I have to tell you, our budget for groceries in 1975 was $5 a week. I know that doesn't seem like much now, but that's all that we could afford back then. So we did our grocery shopping, got the essentials, checked out, had them bagged up, made our way back to our car. As we were walking across the car parking lot at the grocery store, we noticed there was a liquid running from our car down the parking lot into the storm drain. It kind of got our attention. The closer that we got to our car, we smelled this strong odor of gasoline. Well, we arrived at our car, and what we discovered was the metal straps that had held the gas tank onto the car had rusted away, and the gas tank had fallen off the car there in the middle of the grocery store parking lot. Now, you might imagine we were pretty dejected over that. Really didn't know what to do. We were driving an old 1964 Ford. It was kind of beat up and rusted. We didn't have another car. So there we stood in the middle of this grocery store parking lot, not knowing what to do. And there in the parking lot with us was a couple. I don't remember what they looked like. I don't remember their names. I don't even know if they told us their names. But they saw the predicament that we were in. And out of their heart, they offered to give us a ride home along with our groceries. And they did. They gave us a ride home, and we were able then to kind of set things in motion to be able to get another vehicle. I wanted to share with you today about that original story that Jesus told about the Good Samaritan. It's found in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew in the New Testament. And one day, a man approached Jesus. We're told he was a lawyer. Now, a lawyer in Jesus' day wasn't like a lawyer in our day. A lawyer in Jesus' day was somebody who was very well versed in the Jewish law. So this man approaches Jesus one day, and he says to Jesus, "What do I have to do to inherit eternal life?" Well, Jesus responds to him and says, "Well, you have to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your soul, with all of your strength. You have to love God completely." And he said to him, "And you also have to love your neighbor as yourself." Now, this lawyer, he kind of felt like he had done all those things. He felt like he was doing well at loving God with all of his heart. He felt like he was doing well at loving his neighbor as himself. You see, the lawyer was somewhat self-righteous. So he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And that's when Jesus tells him the parable or the story of the Good Samaritan. As Jesus begins to tell this story, he says, there was a man who was going down the road to Jerusalem, and he was attacked by robbers. The man was robbed, he was stripped of his clothing, he was beaten, and he was left for half dead. You know what? You and I, sometimes we have experiences like that where it feels like our experiences have left us kind of dead on the inside. Jesus continues the story, and he tells that a priest comes walking down the road. When the priest sees the wounded man lying on the road, the priest actually crosses the road to the other side. Not much later, a Levite comes walking down the road, and he sees the wounded man also, and he also crosses the road. Now, both of those men were very religious men, but they did nothing to help the wounded man. Now, I don't know if the couple in the parking lot of that grocery store when I was 18 were religious or not, but I'm so glad and thankful to God that they were there to be good Samaritans to us. Jesus continues telling his story to the lawyer and says, a Samaritan man, a man who was looked down upon by that same priest and that same Levite, comes across the wounded man. And when he sees the man, he stops and he has compassion on the man. He tends to the man's wounds. He puts him on his own donkey, and then they set off for an inn where they check into the inn for the evening, and the Samaritan takes care of that wounded man all throughout the night. Took care of him. The next day, the Samaritan pays the innkeeper to take care of the man until he's better, with the promise that if he uses up all the money in caring for the man, he'll pay him even more. So after telling the lawyer this parable about the Good Samaritan, Jesus asked him, who was a neighbor to the wounded man? See, because that was the lawyer's original question, who's my neighbor? And the lawyer says back to Jesus, well, the one who showed him mercy was the neighbor. And Jesus said to him, you're right. Now I want you to go and do the same thing. I think we can learn some things from the story of the Good Samaritan. We can learn that we can be very religious, even self-righteous, like the lawyer was, and like the priest was, and like the Levite was, and yet we can be indifferent to our neighbors. We can also learn from the story about the Good Samaritan. You see, he didn't know exactly what had happened to the wounded man. And you and I, we never know what is currently going on in someone's life, how they might be wounded, how they might be needy. And from the story, we learn that it takes compassion to be a Good Samaritan. It begins by reaching out with just a touch of mercy. That's what the Samaritan offered to the wounded man. And you know, that's something that we need in our country and our world right now. Touches of mercy for one another. I wanted to share with you an opportunity that I had to be a Good Samaritan to somebody else that required a touch of mercy. I was pastoring a small church in the short north of Columbus. You know, it was kind of an inner city church. And as I would walk along the sidewalks in the short north, invariably I'd run into people who were panhandling. And I ran into a man one day who was panhandling, and he was very unique. He had some distinguishing characteristics about him. We had a brief conversation on the sidewalk, and I actually gave him a couple of dollars. A number of weeks later, I was going into a Kentucky Fried Chicken store for lunch, and here was this same man panhandling outside of the KFC. He asked me if I had a couple bucks or some spare change. I told him I didn't, and that was the truth. But I did offer to take him into the KFC and buy him lunch. And you know what? He took me up on that offer. So we went into the KFC, I placed my order, and I told the cashier whatever this man would want, also give that to him. As we were waiting on our food, this man began to tell me a little bit about his story. He told me how depression had run in their family, how his father, in his depression, had taken his own life, and how he himself, at a younger age, was very depressed also. In fact, he was so depressed one day that he began to walk on a railroad track. And as he walked on the railroad track, he was struck by a train and he lost one of his arms. See, this man had told me that very first time I met him that his name was Chicken Wing. Obviously because he didn't have one arm. I never knew his name. I just knew him as Chicken Wing. But we stood there and talked, and he told me more about his life and more about his story and how he came to live on the street and be a panhandler. And all I did that day was listen. And for me and you to be good Samaritans, sometimes that's all it takes, is that we're willing to listen to somebody else's story. I hope during this time of emergency in our country that you and I can become great listeners, and maybe we'll have the opportunity to be a good Samaritan to somebody, because that's all that they might need in that moment, is somebody with a listening ear. I hope you take encouragement from this, and until the next time, God bless you all.